will not enjoy security without development. Will not enjoy development without security. And will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. This statement was said by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And today, I want to explain why. I want to start by citing two persons I got to know some years back in India. A young landless laborer told me, when I first met her, that all the people of her village were friends. Gita was her name. After a few months, she realized that I was not a spy for the landlord or for the village administration. And then she told me a different story. I quote, "I find it very unfair that some people have so much food and we have so little. It should have been equal. But if I ask a question to the landlord, he would punish me. There is nothing in the world that I fear more than the rich. I am afraid of their harassment, I am afraid of their violence, and I am afraid of losing my job." In another village, I got to know a landlord. His name was Raja. In the beginning, he told me, "We are all friends in this village. They come to my house to give me gifts at festivals, when we marry, and in other situations." After some months, he also started to trust me, and he told me a different story. He said, "We don't like people from lower castes. We don't like to see casteless and low-caste people own land. So sometimes villages get demolished, or people, families get killed. Many casteless or low-caste people have been killed by our thugs because they wanted to develop or because they demanded higher salaries." He also told me that his family sometimes asked the local government or the local police for their assistance. For example, they would ask the police to imprison some people who had protested when the landlord took their land. Or sometimes the landlord and his family, they would ask the village administration to register some land in the name of their cat or their dog or a dead relative. Then it would seem that they were the proper owner of this piece of land. The police staff and government officials would normally do it, either for a small bribery or out of fear, he told me. Gita's and Raja's situations are not unique. You can find similar stories in several places in the world, in several countries. In such situations, it's not enough to dig a well or put up an electric cable or plant to get development. We need to focus on the human beings living there. This is important in order to make sure that no one is excluded, left out from the development. For this reason, as well as for several others, I will argue today that a human rights-based approach is useful and it's important in development cooperation. The human rights approach is useful, and I will try to give you a couple of examples why. But first, a few words about what human rights are and what a human rights-based approach is. Human rights, they are universally agreed and they are legally binding standards in order to ensure a life in dignity, equality and freedom for every individual. They are agreed by governments in the United Nations. And their objective is not to provide total care to passive recipients, but rather to promote the development of individuals with equal rights and freedom from fear and want. What is also unique with the human rights is that they have corresponding state obligations. All governments are obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of their citizens. And then you have the human rights-based approach, which is based on the human rights. This consists of cross-cutting human rights principles, and they can guide the state's partners, NGOs, and individuals in the work to promote and implement human rights. But not only that, also to promote and implement general development programs. The human rights approach can help us focus on people instead of just the mere services or things. It can help us identify and change the inequality between Gita and Raja. How can we, for example, promote a fair, effective and non-discriminatory healthcare system or educational system that doesn't exclude indigenous peoples, girls, etc.? How can we make sure that taxation policy is fair, that the poor don't pay much bigger share of their earnings than the rich, and so on? I will argue that a human rights approach is the way to go. I want to give you a couple of examples on why. But first, I just want to have a little quiz. I'll give you 2 statements about human rights, and you should try to find out if they are true or false. Statement 1. The right to health means that everybody has the right to be healthy. Is this true or false? This is false. The individual's health cannot be guaranteed by any government, even the most wealthy governments. But everybody should at least be guaranteed basic healthcare services. Human rights-based health programs do not only focus on infrastructure and vaccines, not the physical things, but also how to develop health systems that are based on non-discrimination, availability, accessibility, affordability, acceptability, and good quality. That is the right to health. And then the statement 2. You should try to find out if it's true or false. Countries facing difficult financial situations do not have the duty to ensure human rights, such as the right to food. Is this true or false? This is also false. All countries that have ratified the Human Rights Conventions have the duty to respect, protect and fulfill the human rights, as I mentioned previously. If you're a poor country, you have fewer resources to spend, of course. But you should still spend the maximum available resources that you have, and you should work to realize human rights progressively as your economy develops. This means that there are higher standards expected for a government like Norway or Switzerland than of lower income countries such as Malawi or Sudan. I would like to share with you an example from the Norwegian Development Corporation. The example is a good illustration, I think, on how a human rights-based approach can be a tool for development. This particular project was run by the Norwegian Church Aid and a local partner in Tanzania. They focus particularly on the human rights principle transparency and accountability. And they apply them as tools to enhance the right to water. I just briefly want to mention the normative criteria for the right to water. That is that water is available, accessible, affordable, acceptable and safe, the same as for the right to health. Before telling you about the concrete project in Tanzania, in this particular village, I just want to explain the human rights-based method that they used. The project was based on something called a Public Expenditure Tracking System, abbreviated PETS. And this system is designed to empower right holders at grassroots level, to make them able to demand rights-based services from the government. For this purpose, people who participate in PETS, they are trained to read and to analyze public budgets and accounts, and they're also trained to monitor how the financial plans are implemented if at all. So if they find that realities on site differ from what it says in the budget, and for example, if the account varies from what you see on the ground, the committee, they have been trained on how they can file the complaints. So they will try to secure interventions against corruption, for example, by complaining to higher level government officials. So this is the method that they used. And the example I will share with you today is about hijacked water services in Kilolo in Tanzania. At the beginning of the program period, the water situation in Kilolo was very difficult. The community only had access to public water once a week, and then only for a few hours. The most reliable water supply was actually provided by private business. A retired colonel sold water to water boys who used bicycles to transport and sell water in Kilolo and neighboring villages. Community members felt that the prices were way too high. Some women paid with sexual services because they were desperate to get water from the water vendors. The local Pets Committee found out that the local government actually had a water official who was the same as the retired colonel. So that means he was selling the water as his own private business. They found that money had come from the district to develop the water systems, and then the colonel had hijacked the public water sources, just taken it. He hired middlemen who came with trucks at night and collected the water, and then he hired cycling water boys who sold the water for a high price to the inhabitants. The money went into his own pocket. The committee asked the village government to call a meeting, and they asked if they could talk to the water officer and ask him a number of simple but pertinent questions. Who owns this water? Why doesn't the community get water? What is the problem? The retired colonel refused to provide answers, and instead he replied, "When did you ever see a rat chasing a cat?" Following the meeting, the retired colonel fabricated a case against the human rights activists, and some of the key activists were imprisoned and charged with damaging public property. Others got their shops closed down. The human rights activists continued their work and their struggle, and they shared their report with a member of the parliament. They also contacted the district commissioner. As a result, the legal case that had been fabricated against them was dropped, and the corrupt water officer was replaced, and the water was released to the community. And on the top of that, the village assembly had become much more attentive to the issues raised by the people of Kilolo. The Kilolo case shows how human rights can empower citizens to raise questions. The local authorities have now realized that citizens have questions and are demanding accountability, not only in implementation, but also in priority setting. We have found that the project has had impact on several levels. First, it has led to empowerment of rights holders to demand their rights and their rights-based services from local government. Second, it has led to improved gender equality. Women, they've been very active in the work to track the public expenditures, and now they actually have received a higher status in the local community because the community gets better service delivery. Third, it has led to accountability at the grassroots level. People at the grassroots are able to hold their leaders to account when public resources are misused. And fourth, It has led to better service delivery from the local government. Ordinary citizens are now able to determine and assure value for money by comparing the public resources that are used with the public services offered. And then finally, of course, the most important, the right to water has been fulfilled. Several academic studies come up with more or less the same results as what we find in Kilala. A human rights-based approach to development programs has the potential to lead to positive change. I'll give you 4 examples from academic research. The first one is a recent study by the UK Interagency Group on Human Rights-Based Approaches. A researcher compared 14 human rights-based programs and 14 non-human rights-based programs in Bangladesh, Malawi and Peru. And both kinds of projects led to impact, to immediate impact. Impact that benefited stakeholders and resulted in improved living conditions for the target groups. But interestingly found that the human rights-based projects generated a greater range of positive impact and more depth, in-depth change for the target groups. And that was because the human rights-based programs, they focused on the underlying causes of poverty, why people were poor, and they tried to change the structures behind. So what you found was that these projects, they were more sustainable and they lasted even during difficult times. They found actually that the human rights projects led to several important changes. They led to strengthened asset accumulation, reduced vulnerability, reduced social exclusion, improved access to justice, enhanced livelihood security and diversification, increased knowledge and skills, increased protection against gender-based and other social discrimination, and increased protection against work-based exploitation. Important gains. The second piece of evidence is from the World Bank. Last year, the World Bank published a study. It was actually financed by Norway and a few other donors. It was on human rights and economics. It concluded that human rights and human rights-based approaches may improve development outcomes and the quality of economic growth, both in short term and in long term. It found that human rights can be an effective tool for poverty reduction, and this for 3 reasons. The first one was that human rights contribute to empowerment and social protection of marginalized groups. The second was that human rights reinforce the work on equity and equality. And the third was that human rights bring added attention to legal approaches. The third piece of evidence I want to share is made by the economist Alfredo Sver Yunis. He has found that human rights are highly correlated with economic development and are often forerunners for economic development. He says that ensuring human rights is a vital step towards economic development because when people are denied their rights, it often results in social instability, war, and conflicts. And these again have vast economic consequences. Furthermore, violations of human rights are a major determinant of poverty. Sver Yunis says, to take away the power to use and to allocate human rights endowments is to convict poor people to poverty. Human rights principles form a set of norms that are central to the humanization of development processes and outcomes, he states. The fourth piece of research I want to share with you is made by Lawrence Bloom and Stefan Voigt. They look into the impact of human rights on economic development. They find that human rights have a strong positive influence on the accumulation of physical capital and total factor of productivity and economic development. In addition, they state that we can argue for a human rights-based approach to development cooperation also irrespective of the economic consequences, as long as people value being treated decently. Most people I know do appreciate that. In order to succeed, we must make sure that we do not only focus on the end results. We should also make sure that every single step that's taken towards our goals is fully grounded in human rights principles. That means that not only the end result, for example, the human rights, are what we focus on, but also the way towards the fulfillment of the human rights. For example, you should ask if the program focuses on participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, human dignity, empowerment, and rule of law. These principles are basic human rights principles for all human rights. In short, these 7 principles can be abbreviated PANTHER. And let me explain this. Participation, for example. I have been to a school in Somalia where the girls didn't dare to go to school. Why was that? Because nobody had asked them whether they wanted the latrines to be next door to the boys' latrine or if they needed it to be somewhere else. And it was too high a risk for them to go to school and use the bathroom next door to the boys. So then, when they were invited to participate and to share their opinions, of course, the latrines were built separately from the boys, and more girls were allowed and dared to enter school. So meaningful participation in the planning process is the best way to make sure that the project is relevant and good for those it's meant for. Then you have accountability. I've been to a healthcare clinic that was set up privately, by private means. It was built next door to the public healthcare center, and the public hospital was so poor. They didn't have any facilities, they had hardly any trained staff. In a human rights perspective, instead of setting up a private initiative, you should work with the local government and try to strengthen the accountability of the government, of the health officials, to make sure this public health care has what they need to provide health care for the inhabitants. So we must collaborate with the local government and the local health workers in order to strengthen the existing public health care and make sure the government is accountable to the citizens. Then you have non-discrimination. I've seen a village where they built a well to provide water for the local community. It was meant for everybody in the village. What happened was that the Dalit people, the people who are casteless, this was in India, when they came to collect water, people threw stones at them and they broke their buckets. They were not allowed to use the well. A human rights approach always makes sure that you find ways to include all groups of society, regardless of ethnic origin, caste, religion of belief, gender, sexual orientation, political adherence, and so forth. Then you have transparency. We saw that, how important that was in Kilolo. All development programs should be transparent. I think the killer law example speaks for itself. When you know what the plans are, you can demand your rights respected, protected, and fulfilled. Budgets and financial reports, they must be made public, and information about these ought to be available and accessible and understandable for the inhabitants. And then you have the human dignity principle. Human dignity should guide all development programs as well. I have seen heartbreaking examples of energy programs where people were asked, it's supposed to be consultancy processes with the stakeholders. And these are supposed to be free. People are supposed to say what they think and mean in a dignified way. But I've seen energy programs and other programs as well where the stakeholders, they've been threatened not to come and share their viewpoints because their views are not in line with those planning for the energy plant to be set up. And I've also seen people being bribed, people being told, if you come and say this and that, I will give you rice or a t-shirt or something. So do stakeholders feel they themselves and others have dignity? Or are people threatened, like in the example of Gita and Raja? We cannot afford to neglect the issue of power. The example of Gita explains why we need to make sure people have the empowerment in themselves to speak out. In the neighboring village of the village of Gita, they had managed to organize a group of landless laborers, and they had actually managed to be able to speak out and report to the government about the corrupt landlord who annexated their land. So this was a way to empower the inhabitants. There are other ways too. We must make sure that those in power are not by our programs getting even more powerful. Or we must make sure that our programs give a voice to the marginalized and excluded and stigmatized groups of society, because they are the ones who need it the most. Then we have rule of law, finally. It's important to keep an eye on rule of law in development programs. I've seen changes on the ground. For example, female genital mutilation, where this has been outlawed in Ethiopia. It has been a very important tool for women to say no to genital mutilation. Justiciability reinforces the progressive realization of human rights. It can provide relief by giving legal recognition to the rights of the poor. And I think it's a very important and necessary step towards the implementation of state accountability. We have research-based evidence, and we have empirical, on-the-ground-based evidence of the positive impact of human rights to development. We have evidence that poverty, inequality, and corruption can be reduced on a sustainable basis. Human rights approaches, we have seen, can also accelerate economic development. I would say this is a good example of a win-win situation. But human rights are not automatically respected, protected, and fulfilled by merely including human rights buzzwords in program plans and reports. They need to be included in a systematic and thorough and context-sensitive way. We must make sure they are locally owned, and they should also be developed by multiple stakeholders. Like we should talk not only to Gita or not only to Raja, but we should make sure they are both included in the process. Human rights programs, as well as other programs, should be developed in line with the human rights principles we have been talking about today. You know, the participation and accountability, the non-discrimination and transparency, the human dignity and empowerment, and the rule of law, the PANTHER principles. The PANTHER should be included from the very beginning, from the preparation of the program, and until the very end and beyond. Human rights are more than rights for the majority and for the affluent populations. The litmus test for human rights-based programs, I would say, is the extent to which it leads to fulfillment of the rights of minority groups and marginalized groups of society. There is always a risk for human rights of being captured by elites and middle classes. But the empirical examples and the research findings I've presented today demonstrate that they have important potential gains, also with regard to improving living conditions and quality of life for people living in poverty. We must not forget that human rights have a value in themselves. They place people at the center of development processes. People should not be seen as beneficiaries with needs, but as active citizens with rights, dignity, and entitlements. I'd like to close by citing Rehemba Mwangi in Kilolo, Tanzania. He said, "I see a big difference. We had difficulties accessing water, but now we can get as much water as we need."